Parent of killers, what's your story? My uncle raped and murdered his disabled daughter and tried to frame someone else so he could collect insurance money. He got away with it for almost 20 years. One day, I get a phone call from my dad saying that we should expect the family name in the news and why. Edit. My uncle was not my child, and as such this was off topic. She was mid-teens and developmentally disabled. He tried to frame a supposed hitchhiker serial killer in the 80s. Tried to follow the same patterns. He was caught via a cold case study. Early tests had some of his DNA on her, but protection was used during the rape, and he had a passable alibi at the time. When some of the DNA was retested, they found more clues linking my uncle to the murder, and after checking with said alibi, the person who gave it confessed that they lied. The moment the police came for my uncle, he cried and thanked them for catching him. He admitted the whole thing right away, and said that he couldn't handle her anymore, took out the life insurance policy, and did as he did. He is in jail for life, and getting at least part of what he deserves there. He has been disowned by literally every member of the family, and 2 of his nephews have changed at least part of their name. That was from his ex-fiancée of 7 years together. He started doing meth without me knowing. 5 years and 2 kids in. Tried to get him help. When I found out, left him because he refused it. They caught him in his victim's car. He confessed 12 days into his trial. Got life plus 10. Said he wanted to know how it felt to kill someone. I'm raising our 2 kids. They don't know yet. Don't plan on telling them until they're old enough. Kills me that they will have to live with a burden like that. It's massively unfair. They certainly don't deserve it, and neither did the victim or his family. Off the meth. He was the type of person that would help the homeless, generous, outgoing, excessively intelligent and ambitious. How heavy drugs can change people into monsters. Not me, but my mother was in a relationship with a serial killer / pedophile. In the early to mid 80s my mom started dating this guy. She already had my older sister with another man. New boyfriend was a doting stepdad. They lived in Las Vegas. My mom ran Keno, and he was a card counter. She'd help disguise him because he was blacklisted from most casinos for the aforementioned card counting. I came along. They continued to be the happy little super dysfunctional family until the FBI grabs my mom from work and interrogates her for hours about him. He's a rapist / pedophile / murderer. My mom didn't know. She dabbled in low-level criminality, but not that stuff. Splits town with us kids. Gets back with older sister's dad. I grow up not knowing this until I'm 14 and my parents divorce and dad asks for a DNA test for me and I'm floored. Your dad isn't your dad, it's actually this evil man who's on death row. My mom's a huge drunk and drug addict. She can't even speak to me about this without a full-fledged mental breakdown, so everything I know is spotty. She passed away 4 years ago. I'm going through her stuff and find some letters from the History Channel contacting her to participate in a documentary about him. One thing that chills me to my core, he used to call her his first victim's name during search. She swore she never knew until after the fact, and I believe her. My stepson killed one of his bullies in high school. He has a cleft palate, and it's a pretty bad one. All his life he's been bullied for it. His mother and I have done everything we could to stop the bullying, but it never ceased. We contacted administrators, moved, switched schools, tried everything. Eventually, we decided on an online homeschooling program. Unfortunately, one of his bullies from his last school knew where we lived. He'd come by and taunt my stepson regularly. My wife and I were never around because the kid would come while we were working. One day, after my son tried ignoring his previous taunting, the bully figured it must have been a good idea to break in and find him. He threw a brick through our back window, which was in the guest bedroom, and proceeded to attempt to enter. Now, I partially blame myself for what happened next. My son never knew his real father, and so since I've come in, I've done everything in my power to fill in, and we grew pretty close. I ended up trusting him enough to tell him where I kept my gun. Seeing as how his mother and I worked so often, I wanted him to be able to protect himself if anything were to happen, if we were gone. So, he grabs my gun, opens the door to where the bully was, and shot him in the chest twice. He died before the ambulance reached the scene. My son was never charged for anything. as there was obvious evidence of a forced entry, and the neighbors claim that the bully repeatedly said he was gonna kill my son when he got inside. This happened almost 10 years ago, when my son was 15. He's been to so many different psychologists and therapists since then. Something in him changed that day, like he blamed himself. For years he tried to isolate himself from the world. He became a heavy alcoholic, and even attempted suicide. He blames himself for taking another human's life, even though he knows his was in danger. Seeing what happened to my boy, it's heartbreaking. I sold the gun, never got another one. To this day, he still has that look of grief and guilt in his eyes. I'm starting to believe no amount of tears will ever wash it away. Edit. Thank you all so much for the support and condolences. It's such a hard thing for me to tell this story, and so many people speaking up for my family brings tears to my eyes. I can't put into words how much this really means to me. Thank you, all of you. Nephew to a killer. My grandmother raised her 6 children in the 1950s and 60s primarily solo. My grandfather suffered a traumatic head injury playing basketball with some friends. Crazy to think about, and his personality flipped like a switch. He became aggressive, impulsive, and abusive, so my grandma gathered my dad and his siblings and fled across the state to live with her sister and her sister's growing family in rural Missouri. My grandmother and her 7 children lived in my great-aunt's small attic space for a while as my grandmother secured a couple of jobs to keep her family afloat. She eventually saved up enough money to buy them a small 2-bedroom home in that same town. My eldest uncle bought the home from her and lives there now. It's a wonder how they managed to live in such a small space with 7 people. It is hardly big enough for just one. She lived in that home well after her children had moved out. My uncle that killed someone was the 3rd oldest, my dad the 3rd youngest, so they were pretty close in age. My uncle had 2 children with his wife. Several years later, my dad and my mom adopted my brother and I. My uncle filed for divorce from his wife when I was very young. He ultimately lost custody of their children, but because he filed for the divorce, he had assumed that custody would go to him. According to my mom, the court's decision kind of made him snap. He tracked down his ex-wife's lawyer and shot him dead. After a short time on the run, he turned himself in and was locked away in prison for life until passing away unexpectedly last year. I didn't really know my grandma before all of this happened, since I was so little, but from what I've been told, the whole ordeal really subdued her. She was always friendly to others and well networked in her small town, but some of her friends stopped being so warm after they found out what happened with my uncle, so her social circle dwindled. She became more reclusive and quiet. During holiday family gatherings, it was pretty standard for her to sit at the kitchen table just watching everyone quietly. Even through all of this, I remember her as one of the warmest, kindest, most generous people I have ever known. Throw away because the investigation is still ongoing. I'm not the parent in this case, just the siblings. I have a half sister along with one full sister and one half brother. My relationship with my mom was strained, and I didn't know my half siblings much. I knew my half sister had troubles talking growing up, and my half brother is autistic. My mom died recently, and I got a bunch of info from roommates, family members, etc. My half sister abused our mom in every way possible. She also threatened to kill my mom when she didn't have things go her way. A few months before my mom died, my half sister killed my mom's roommate's dog in a fit of rage after being told no for something. She didn't get in trouble because A, dogs are considered property so there wouldn't be heavy jail time, and B, my maternal grandma paid the roommate to not press charges plus to cover the dog. I didn't ask how my half sister killed the dog because the fact that she could even bring harm to a pet made me sick to my stomach. There had also been several domestic abuse call-ins to the local police department because my half sister was violently abusing my mom. They have several records of having to come out and check on things. Not long after was the dog incident my mom died. From what the roommate said, my mom and half sister were fighting because my half sister didn't want to go to school. My mom was already sick and weak at this time. All of a sudden it got quiet in the other room, and then my half sister started screaming for help. Roommate runs in to find half sister hunched over my mom's body. It took 4 months to get the autopsy results. They declared her death as "undetermined" because they couldn't be quite sure if it was the fact that my mom was already sick or something else. The police we spoke to was honest with me, and we both felt like my half-sister had something to do with it, given literal "I will kill you" claims and physical abuse my half-sister put on my mom. Both my half-siblings are with CPS now and were supposed to be medically evaluated for mental illness but never were. We had 4 caseworkers in 6 months, and it took 2 months to send my half-siblings one letter. When we mentioned the entire situation, CPS was shocked. Apparently the latest caseworker hadn't read the file and had no idea, and is now, half a year later, trying to get a psyche evaluation on my half-sister. I'll never know for sure, but given what I know and the records I've seen, I believe my half-sister killed my mom. Obligatory and cliche not a parent comment. Downvote if needed. But I thought I'd share the story of my neighbor. Her son, years ago, while on drugs, broke into his ex-girlfriend's apartment and shot her and her new boyfriend dead, then killed himself. I don't know how she was before, but from what other neighbors tell me she was relatively pleasant. Now she is completely broken. She's basically a hermit. I have never seen her leave her house, rarely see her outside. I have no idea how she gets groceries. The only time I do see her are when she shouts at people walking their dogs without a leash down the street. Pretty rural neighborhood, no danger there. She called the cops on me once for it. She is broken, paranoid, and withdrawn from the world. I was mad for a minute when the cops pulled up, but then I realized how tragic it is. Her son ended 3 lives and destroyed so many others. Don't kill people. Obligatory not my kid, but my stepdad's kid, which we will call Jay. He went on a murder spree. He wanted to kill all his family members. He successfully killed both his maternal and fraternal grandfathers. He got caught midway through the murder spree cause he left his great aunt alive and tied up. She got free after he left and called the police and his mom, who was next on the list. Jay stole his great aunt's phone so he could pretend to be her and meet up with his mom. He ended up meeting the police instead. He had tried going to other relatives' homes, but it was in the middle of the workday and people weren't home. Otherwise he would have killed more before getting caught. He got 100 years with 0 chances of parole. The judge said the sentence was symbolic because by the time it's over, there won't be anyone left alive to remember his heinous acts. Edit: I forgot to mention how it's impacted my stepdad. He turned into an alcoholic 4 years afterwards. He did everything he could to help his son be a good person and feels like he failed. He blames himself. His son Jay is criminally insane and had shown that countless times over the course of his life. Jay tried to burn down his school when he was in kindergarten. He had already gone to jail for attempted murder up in Alaska too. Only in the last year or 2 really has my stepdad gotten any better. He's finally getting close again with his daughter, and the drinking has slowed some in part due to my mom. I just wish he would go to therapy and get proper help. It's unlike him to seek that kind of treatment though, cause he is a very private person and that goes against his nature. Edit 2, meant paternal not fraternal. Oops. Throwaway. My wife saw me crying reading this thread and thought it might help to share the story. It wasn't my child, but my dog who murdered a young child. Standard, nicest dog in the world, never saw this coming statement. She really was, never had an incident, never bit anyone, and was great with kids. We were having a cookout. Everything seemed normal. Most of the time the kids would end up back in the house because it had AC, while the adults hung out in the backyard, cooking, drinking, etc. We had 2 dogs, both were mutts, both were shelter dogs. Not sure it matters, but it is always brought up. I'll never forget the screams and kids running from the back door to the backyard. I was on the grill and my wife ran in with a few other parents. Things start to go into a blur here. I apologize, and I kind of figured it was a random accident or kids being kids type deal. One thing I will never forget is my wife shrieking my name. I bolted inside to see my wife wrestling with the dog while it had this poor child in its grip. I rushed the dog and, almost as soon as I grabbed her, she let go. My wife picked up the child and was holding him. At this point other parents rushed in, including the child's parents. I'm sorry I don't remember much here. I remember just holding down my dog while people ran around screaming, crying, and trying to help him. Still, when the paramedics arrived, I had the dog pinned down to the floor. She didn't try and move once. She knew what she did. The child was rushed to the but was pronounced deceased not long after being there. We were heartbroken for the family, obviously. The dog was surrendered and was put down. A few nights later, the husband showed up at our house, intoxicated and wanted to talk. When I stepped outside, he punched me 3 or 4 times and I fell down to the ground. I pretty much fell on him trying to defend myself / being very stunned. He collapsed onto me, embraced me, and we both started crying. We laid there on the front porch for an hour crying into each other's. I'm the son of a piece of shit who tried to kill me and almost killed an old woman. The story about me: when my mam and Pose were still together, he liked to do my bottles, but for some reason I was getting ill a lot every time he did. Turns out he was poisoning me little by little. Mam cut ties, and 20 years later his family get in touch and ask if they can reconnect, and I said yes, as long as he wasn't involved, and they agreed. Turns out he couldn't anyway, as he was inside for something and they wouldn't tell me why. I got on well with them, and they say he's coming out and he really wants to see me. I agree on that. I'll give him one chance, and he has to tell me what he did. He tells me that after my granddad died he went a little crazy, became an alcoholic, and got into a fight where someone almost died. He goes to the toilet and I have a Google whilst I wait. His fight was with 2 80-year-old women who were stuck in a lift/elevator with him. He'd beaten one of them half to death with a bottle of Jack. They only got away because someone had got on a couple of floors up and dragged him away. He came back, I punched him, spit in his face, and walked off before I actually tried to properly hurt him. Extra note: later found out that his brother was a serial killer who strangled gay teens he was faking in the late 80s to hide the fact that he was gay. Not me, but the friend who did it isn't on Reddit, so a very large friend of mine is basically a violence magnet for some reason, like a perfectly random guy in a bar stabbed him with a box cutter once. No explanation, just a box cutter, and then he got clobbered. A while back, 2 guys in his neighborhood broke into his house during the day. His guess was looking for stuff to sell for drugs, and his dog was barking at them before he even got into the room they were in. One of them shot at his dog and missed as he rounded the corner, and he basically beat one to death and the other ran off with broken bones. He was okay, and the dog was fine. No charges were filed, and while he was a little shaken by it at the time, he didn't really feel bad about it ever. He was protecting his dog's life, so no real guilt. But he's not the sort of guy to internalize that sort of thing. I was 3. My grandparents had full custody of me. My dad was a heavy drug user and alcoholic. From my understanding, my mom was to an extent, but my dad was way worse. My mom also had a lot of health issues. I'm not sure all the details of her health. She was bipolar for sure, and was on several heavy meds which she often let my dad use. She had a disability with one of her hands, but she was a very beautiful and kind woman. She was the kind of person, if she had $10 and went to the store, everyone was gonna get something when she got home. My dad killed her one night. Not sure the story of that. All I know is that he chopped her up partly. Couldn't fully dismember her, but he tried. I think he got her head partly off and an arm and made a big gash from hip to hip. He hid her in our trailer closet for 3 days. My grandpa eventually suspected that had happened and called the cops. According to neighbors, the next day he came over and drank beer and watched football and didn't even seem to be a changed person at all. I'm now 21. My dad is gonna be serving at least another 8 to 10 years in prison. He had the chance for parole after 15 years and was denied, but he could serve his whole life. Up until I was 18. I couldn't visit him. I didn't really like to, but I did it to make my family happy. I didn't know how to feel about him, and still don't tbh. I had my visitation rights taken away at 18, since I was a victim of his crimes. I could have it overturned, but not really wanting to, honestly. He only calls when he wants money. Gets well over $1,000 a year from my grandma. I was lied and told it was basically an accidental death until I googled my dad's name when I was 11. I didn't speak to him for over a year, and it was right before Christmas too. My first memory is seeing my mum's grey blue closed casket. About a year ago, my son was using pot occasionally and used it to deal with his depression. One of the kids he hung out with grew some. The grower had a big baggie full of trash stems, leaves with some buds. It wasn't worth it to him to pick out the good parts, so he gave them to my son. A few days later, my son and his friends were going to a river to hang out and do teenage things. They got pulled over, the cops found the weed, and it was a felony amount in our state. We go into debt, get a lawyer, and he gets into a drug diversion program. He stops smoking pot and has to see a probation officer and get drug tested. His depression really starts taking over. He stops hanging out with his friends. He destroyed all of his artwork and pretty much everything else he used to care about. He skips work and lost his job. Then he totaled his car. We did get him to see a psychiatrist, but he wouldn't take the medication. The whole family is worried about him. Monday I had a nice conversation with him, and he was thinking about several different kinds of jobs. He had a job interview scheduled for today. Yesterday, he killed himself. He will be 19 forever. Not a parent, but my co-worker and her son were killed by her other son. Almost 2 years ago now. So killer son spent of his adult life in and out of jail. Small petty crimes, breaking and entering, burglary etc. Nothing violent. Well, his last stint was for credit card fraud. My co-worker didn't want him living with her when he got out, but he ended up staying with her and her other son. Now my co-worker was an older lady, 70s, and she was super reliable. Rarely missed work or at least called when she did. Well, she didn't show up for a shift on a Friday, and it wasn't like her. We tried calling her, no cell phone, cause she was in her 70s, and it was one more useless piece of junk, no answer. So we figured, oh no, maybe she forgot, or she was in the hospital and she couldn't call NBD. But something in my and my boss's chest didn't feel right, but trying not to let our years of forensic files get the best of us, we brushed it off. Come Monday, still no call, no show. Now I'm freaking out. So we had the police go over and do a wellness check. 4 hours later we saw on the news they had found 2 bodies in her neighborhood. I had given her rides home from work a million times as she didn't drive. Car was gone, credit cards were gone. They found her killer son in New York State. Picked him up on a parole violation. I still feel sick about it. She was such a nice lady, she didn't deserve that. Like a lot of comments, not a parent of a killer, but the nephew of one. This all happened before I was born, and I only found out about it a few years ago. My uncle was always a really weird guy, but ultimately he was pretty harmless. He could never hold down a job, still lived with my grandparents, and rarely left the house. He definitely had an undiagnosed mental illness, and had the mindset of a 12-year-old going into his 30s. He spent a lot of time just watching cartoons and talking to himself. One day he got into a fight with my grandpa. Things escalated pretty quickly, and my uncle went into the kitchen to grab a knife. He attacked my grandpa and stabbed him multiple times in the chest before cutting his head off with the knife. He grabbed a lamppost, went into the front yard, and started pretending the lamppost was a gun. He was screaming at the neighbors, yelling that if they got any closer he would shoot them, all while covered in his dad's blood and still carrying his severed head. Somebody called the cops, and he was in a short standoff with them before he was eventually arrested. After that, I don't really know what happened to him. I've tried looking up the story, but I can't find anything on it. I was never told his name or my grandpa's name, and I do not know where or when it happened. I've never talked to my grandma about it, and my mom, understandably, doesn't want to talk about it, so I've never pressed her for details. My best guess is that it took place in Illinois sometime in the late 70s or early 80s. Other than that, I honestly don't know. Not parents, but my husband and I knew a guy who starved his 15-month-old to death. Basically, we knew this guy for a while. My husband worked with him, and we were fairly good friends with him and his wife. Apparently there was some trouble in the marriage and his wife left him and took their little boy with her. She soon realized though that she couldn't support the baby financially, and so her husband came and got the baby so he could care for him. He kinda went off the radar for a while and we didn't see or hear from him, and then one day he messages us asking to hang out. Kinda out of the blue, but we agreed. He comes over without the baby, said he was at the neighbors, and makes some unsettling comments. He gets a few weird phone calls while there and finally leaves. My husband and I thought it was odd, but he was always a bit odd, so we just let it go. Then like 2 days later his wife calls me, absolutely hysterical, telling me the baby is dead and her husband is in jail. This whole time she's been like 800 miles away and didn't suspect anything until right before he was arrested. She had asked to talk to the kid and her husband kept refusing, so she called his supervisor at work, Air Force. Apparently the baby had died of starvation about a month before he came to our house that night. He was apparently leaving a 15-month-old alone every day for 12 hours while he worked. It was traumatizing. He ended up taking a plea deal, but if he hadn't, my husband and I were both subpoenaed to testify against him in court. This was like 5 years ago now. It scarred me for life. I have a son who is 8 days younger than his son was. He got 40 years in prison and is eligible for parole in 20, which is ridiculous in my opinion. I've never really gotten over it, and knowing that he had his baby killing hands on my child that night makes me sick to my stomach. I can't even begin to imagine how the child's mother feels. Disclaimer, daughter of a possible killer. TLDR, think my mom killed her sister. So I know this doesn't quite respond to the question and will be buried. Some foreground. I figured out in my early 20s that my mom's a sociopath. Very complex long story, but what was uncovered at that point was financial fraud, stealing mine and my sister's and my dad's and her parents' identities, got into bank accounts, forged tax and mortgage and credit card documents, really faked us all over in myriad ways. At the time it started coming out, it was me and my youngest sister who had undeniable proof of the fraud, forged checks, but we thought at first she had a drug problem and didn't prosecute. Also around that time she was taking several of our middle sister's friends, 19 to 20 years old, as lovers, and though we tried to be in denial it was just so fucking obvious. She tried to convince them that my dad was a rapist, insanely jealous, and was going to kill them, hoping that one of them would be scared enough to kill him first. It was purely for insurance money. I know that sounds nuts, but I have lots of details if anyone wants them. Long story short, divorce happened. Dad did not die. But the whole thing really made me wonder about what happened to her sister. My mom had a sister 1.5-2 years younger. My mom and her parents always called her Lisa, but I just recently figured out her legal name was Elizabeth. Lisa died when I was a bit shy of a year old, in 1980. Now, when I was growing up all I ever heard about Lisa was from my mom's parents and my dad that she died of an undiagnosable blood disorder, and/or from my mom that Lisa was one of the earliest AIDS victims and she got it from using fourth drugs because she was just generally an addict and a junkie. Here's what's weird. 1. My mom never ever told us anything positive about her sister. It was all, oh, well, she was a junkie and was using needles. It's sad but she got AIDS and died. But then on the anniversary of Lisa's death she'd get plastered and, like, fake cry about how she was an only child. 2. Later in life, like around the time and shortly after I quit speaking to my mom, I actually talked to her mother. Her dad was dead by then, about Lisa. Her description of Lisa's decline does not match up at all with the progress of untreated HIV. It wasn't infections, wasn't cancer, was fairly sudden multiple organ failure. Went on for a few months. The doctors said blood disease because her hemoglobin wasn't moving oxygen properly, but it was kidney and liver shutdown that killed her. 3. It's just pretty unlikely that a white woman in a Pennsylvania suburb would be among the first AIDS deaths in the US. I mean, this is 1980. And I totally get that it's possible, but I talked to her mother and my dad, and they said she just smoked a little pot. Like everyone did. Obviously she could have been hiding a serious drug problem, but the only indication I have of that is from my mom. 4. Why the fuck would my mom harp on this drugs/AIDS narrative? Is that really how you want your children to think of their deceased aunt, whom you ostensibly love? Literally the only other story she ever told me about my aunt was that mom, accidentally dislocated Lisa's shoulder when they were kids. What the fuck? 5. So this is according to my dad, who is a very smart dude, but, I think, a bit of a narcissist. So not sure what to trust. Anyway, parents were married early 19. They were living out west while he was in grad school. He was fed up with mom going out and doing coke all night, had divorce papers ready, a huge thing. BC he was Catholic, and she surprise gets pregnant. I'm convinced she put a needle through the condom. It broke. There was no plan B then. He'd never abandon his child. He stayed. I was born. We lived there till I was almost 2. He says both of us used to get sick a lot, vomiting, fevers, etc. Lisa was fine and healthy when I was born. Mom took me to see her and her parents when I was 8 months or so. Shortly thereafter Lisa got super sick. Went into the hospital. A few months on dialysis, but everything was shutting down. No real diagnosis. She died. I've done a little research on poisons, but I don't have enough info on the progress of Lisa's illness to get very far. My mom's parents are dead now. My mom's still alive. Haven't spoken to her in 12 years or so. It's complicated. 2 of my sisters are still on her side. I'm a historian. I'm pretty good with tracking down dead people. Thinking of figuring out what happened to my aunt into a documentary project. Maybe. I know it would be a familial clusterbomb, but maybe worth it. An old coworker of mine helped in the murder of her own mother. It happened while she was employed, and she was caught and sentenced. If I have the story correct, she got pregnant by her then boyfriend. Since she was only a teenager, her mother suggested getting an abortion and really disliked her boyfriend. Her and her boyfriend decided that the only solution to this predicament was to murder her mother. So they got some friends and did just that. The mom was beaten, stabbed, choked, and thrown in the trunk of her own car. Then the body was left inside the trunk, parked where she worked. I obviously never spoke to her afterwards, since she's now facing 50 years, but she definitely did not give off vibes of being a killer. She was super weird and eccentric, not like too much but rather tolerated. High energy type person. It's still weird to know that we worked side by side for weeks. I can probably find the article if it's not against this sub's rules. This happened in my village last September. A red Mini used to block the corner of a junction that I have to use to get to the main road of our housing. Super annoying, and daily, mainly from my partner, we would say how it was illegal and how annoying it was. Cut to September. I had the day off, but my partner was working. When they came home they told me how there was tarpaulin covering the Mini, but when they drove past it the wind caught it and you could see paint on the car. They said that it thought it looked like it said cheat or cheater, but we're unsure. We both had a few days off work, so we didn't leave the house, but my partner saw the news on our second day off, and it said there was a murder in our village. Now nothing happens in this village. Very cliché, I know. After checking the local news the story goes like this. Woman thought her partner was cheating on her, so she painted the word cheater on the car and then smashed it up. She then covered it and got it scrapped it all in the day. He comes home, they argue, and soon after she stabs him once in the chest. He then leaves the house and stumbles out onto the road. She calls 999 and tells them that he stabbed himself. When the police arrive she is seen cleaning the blood off the door while he is dying on the road 5 meters away, and the knife used to stab him was found in a small unused drain in their back garden. Sad thing is that she has a child. She's been found guilty and sentenced to minimum 14 years. As a kid who had a parent in prison and another parent who didn't want custody, I really feel sorry for the kid who now has had their world turned upside down and no mother for 14 years. It was weird seeing the guy's blood still on the road the next 2 days. It's no the most interesting story, but no one ever parks on that corner anymore. This just reminded me of something. When I was a child, my mother and I moved to the country when I was about 8 years old. She didn't know anyone and didn't have many of the useful tools that people generally need for living in the country. An axe, snowplow, tow hitch, things like that. We lived about 30 kilometers from the nearest town, at the end of a private road with a couple of cottages and 2 other homes. Luckily we met our closest neighbor Ken, who was helpful and nice enough. He'd take me fishing and snowmobiling in the winter and stuff, and he lived about half a kilometer up the road. Ken had a daughter who was in grade 9 or 10 and lived with her mother. They were separated or divorced, and the daughter worked at a little restaurant up the road. I guess after a while of helping my mom out with tools and yard work and stuff, he started to get too attached and pushy. She politely broke ties and I didn't see him for a couple of weeks. One day walking to the school bus, I noticed that Ken's screen door had been half ripped off the frame. Then on my way to school, there was a few cop cars at the restaurant that his daughter Sandy worked. When I got home from school that day, my mom sat me down to explain what had happened. Ken had gone to the Mill Pond restaurant armed with a shotgun, and in front of a crowd of diners, gunned down his wife Gloria. Sandy ran outside. Ken followed and gunned her down in the parking lot. His body was found in his car with a shotgun wound to the head a few kilometers up the road. My mom was shaken, and although it was grisly, I guess I was too young to form any lasting emotions about it. But now that I look back, I can't help but think of how close my mom and I were to that situation. He could have easily taken his anger out on us, a lone mother and son combo living at the end of his private road, before he killed himself. Not my son, but another family member. I don't know if it's murder as much as self-defense / protecting yourself, but my aunt and uncle used to own post offices in an island during the height of the Troubles, and up until very recently, so they always had a shotgun or else a handgun under the counter, as they were always small franchises and never had any form of security other than CCTV. It was only very recently, within the last year or so, that I discovered that there had been an afternoon where two relatively well-known local hoods came in and tried to hold up the post office. Their main function here at the time was for doling out pensions, so they were always quite high in cash volumes. The two young men that came in were completely unaware that my uncle was armed. My uncle fired 2 shots not directly at them, but one of the bullets ricocheted and hit one of the men. The robber bled out on the post office floor, and my uncle was never charged with anything, at least that I know of, as there was never a court case or anything, and I would have heard about something like that through the family at some point or another. My uncle doesn't know that I know, and I have never even considered bringing it up in conversation, as it's not really my place to do so, but you can tell it is something that he has clearly thought a lot about. I don't see him any differently though, since I found out what happened, and I still think as a solid man who would do anything for my family. Definitely a dull boy, but a good heart. This is probably gonna get buried, but it's whatever. I'm not a parent or a relative, but my dad's best friend killed his wife. I won't say his name, so we'll just call him John, and his wife Sally. So John and Sally had been married for a few years, but things took a turn for the worse and John got bad into drugs and Sally decided she was leaving him. Well, as the divorce is going through the process of getting finalized, John decides he's bitter and he would rather see her dead than to see her leave. So he drives to her new house one day in the early morning. It was foggy, and he waited for 2 hours in his truck with his gun just contemplating. He finally decides to make his move and walks to the house and kicks the front door in. Well, it's not just the wife who is in the house. It's her daughter, from a previous marriage, and 2 other people. The first people he confronts are the daughter and the 2 other people. He's waving his gun around and screaming about killing her and asking everyone where is his wife. The occupants try to calm him down, but he pistol whips one of them unconscious and walks off in the house to find his wife. The other 2 occupants run to the bathroom and hide, leaving the other person laying down unconscious. He finally finds his wife in her bedroom hiding by the side of her bed. She's begging for her life. "No, John, please. Please, John, I don't wanna die. Please don't kill me, John, please." He shot her in the neck and shoulder and let her die from blood loss. He ran out of the house and disappeared, and he hasn't been found. This happened about 8 years ago. It was a pretty big thing in my community because it was the first murder in 25 plus years, and it was even big enough to be put on America's Most Wanted. Not my kid, but my roommate in college. He was a bouncer at a nightclub and a casino. He is a perfectly normal, well-rounded guy with a good temperament for that line of work. He is about 6 feet 2 inches and in daily gym gotta shape. He had been there for nearly 2 years and seen his share of the drunk casino crowd. One summer about 4 to 5 years ago, he started having recurring issues with the same group of 5 guys. The club has a strict dress code, and the first incident was him not letting a few of them in because of their attire. It's a casino. There are cameras every 6 inches. Management bitches about the details. Anyway, he kicks them out of line and they take it very personally. After this, they keep showing up almost every weekend just to cause problems. Kick signs over, break glasses on the floor, show up and just talk shit, and make general threats at staff and patrons. Management and local PD are aware of this, but what are you going to do except ban them? They end up banned from the premises and dipshit #1 decides to start threatening our roommate over Facebook. Something along the lines of see you this weekend beach, only thing you'll be securing after tomorrow is the hospital. Our roommate made the mistake of not informing management or the police that have already dealt with these clowns of these threats ahead of time. He is at work minding his business and they show up ready to rock and roll one Friday night. My other roommates and I are there. We usually are every Friday night anyway, but we wanted to make sure we were there that night for sure. The tough guys show up, and while they are all smaller than him, they all attack him at once without any dialogue. He is protecting his face, and manages to get his hands on one while ducking blows. We come running out along with a dozen other people waiting in line and chaos ensues. All sorts of random punches and grapples. He snatches the main pose up, and lays down the hardest suplex he could muster. Full extension, 1990s WWF. The guy's thrown down a marble 3-stair, probably 7 feet of vertical from peak to slam, and lands back first bouncing his skull of the marble floor like a basketball. He was dead instantly. It sounded like someone smashed a melon when his head hit. Blood shot out of his mouth and nose like a faking geyser. He gargled and seized, and that was it. I'll never forget watching his eye sockets pool with blood, while his eyes start to dilate, and then disappear under the red goggles. While this is going on, he wraps Hardo #2 up, and manages to get him onto the ground in a ball. He kicks this guy's head against another marble step probably a dozen times, breaking a ton of bones in his face and his forehead. This guy also begins to bleed profusely and sees. His left eye dilates, and he lays there sobbing. He is now permanently paralyzed on the right side of his body from the brain damage he took. Police rush in and arrest faking everyone. It makes the news and is a talk all over town. Our roommate was arrested and then released the next day and spent months waiting for his court date. During this time no one saw him. His girlfriend and brother packed up his stuff at our place. His parents snagged his car. We never really say him again, and have only had very surface level text encounters since. His girlfriend told us he took the whole thing very hard. Because of the Facebook post and numerous previous incidents, he escapes murder/manslaughter for the first pummeling, but the second one was found to be excessive, and he ended up doing about 6 months over it. It will be expunged from his record after 8 years, based on his behavior. He has since moved across the country and I couldn't tell you how he is doing. No social media, no texts with us for years now. I hope he is doing okay. He stepped up to the plate and faced a group of animals that had never been taught a lesson before. Those cunts deserved it. TLDR roommate was a club bouncer and killed one guy and paralyzed another in a fist fight. I was lab partners with a girl who murdered her husband, chopped him up, and scattered the parts. She and I were lab partners in college. She was very religious, well spoken. She talked about her dad being very active in the church and she talked about her husband a lot. She did okay in the class we were in. The next semester a friend was like, "Did you hear Juatisha got arrested for killing her husband?" And I honestly did not believe it until I saw the news article with her mugshot. I heard then that she chopped off his head, hands and feet, and dumped the torso. Years later they make a snapped episode of her. Of course I watched it. It's an absolutely crazy story how she was caught. Spoilers, they identified the body because her husband was in the military and he was missing. They caught her with a random Walmart receipt down the road from the torso, went to the time the purchase occurred on camera, and caught her buying tape, tarps, a saw etc. They still haven't found all the pieces of his body. Edit to add, the class we took was evolutionary biology, where we do a ton of dissections. I cut up a dead animal with a killer. Also, when we told the professor of that class what happened he said HM. She wasn't really good at dissections. My cousin killed someone when he was 13 or 14. He lived with his father's girlfriend, and the girlfriend's daughter, who was somewhere around 6 to 8 at the time I believe. His father was at work, and the girlfriend wouldn't give him a ride. So, he decided to take his father's gun and shoot the girlfriend. After killing her, he tied up the daughter and attempted to rape her, but apparently couldn't perform, so to speak. So he left her there, took the car, and went to an arcade or a pool hall or something to hang out with his friends. He told his friends what he had done, but apparently only one of them took him seriously and alerted the police. I don't recall if this kid called the police from that location or went home to call or what, but once the police were notified, they visited the home. They found the girlfriend's body and the daughter still tied up. Her hands and feet were apparently completely blue/purple from being tied so tightly for so long, and in my recollection, they were concerned at the time about whether she would have nerve damage, or maybe they were concerned they would have to amputate. As you can tell, my memory of some of those details isn't great, mainly because I myself was a child at the time, around the age of the daughter, and also my extended family lived far away from me. My cousin went to juvenile hall and was not tried as an adult. I don't know how long he spent in jail, but he's been out for a very long time. He is married with a daughter and lives in a trailer park. I have met him in person maybe 1 to 2 times, and I told my parents I never want to again. At first it was morbid curiosity, but the way no one in the family ever talks about it sickens me. I get that he is my aunt's son, and he has people that love him, but I have no desire to ever be in his presence again. That being said, I have tried to find out the name of the daughter, because I just want to know if she's okay in life. I mean, how could you be? And I would never contact her directly, because that would probably be traumatic, but the fact that my family members, grandpa, grandma, etc., don't know this person's name really messes with me. My grandmother's sister had a pretty serious case of postpartum depression. She had twins, and one day, while her husband was away for work, she stripped the twins naked, put them on a baking tray, salted and peppered the babies, and was about to put them in the oven when her husband came home early from work, which almost never happened, if my grandmother is to be believed. Thankfully the kids were saved, and her sisters, my grandmother and a different sister, took care of the children until they were 10 and their mother was healthy again. Postpartum depression runs in the family apparently. My grandmother also suffered from it when she had her last kid. She can't remember the 10 first years of my uncle's life. She also nearly beat my mother to death with her bare hands for something minor, hanging clothes crooked or something like that. It's all forgiven, and they are all closed today, since everyone understands it was part of an illness. My aunt also had it bad, and to be frank I'm not sure she ever properly recovered from it. She used to be my favorite aunt, always smiling and kind, but when my cousin was born something changed. She became selfish and self-centered, and she started to attempt suicides over and over. I spent most of my teens being my cousin's big brother/protector, because he had an abusive alcoholic father and a mother that would slit her wrists at a drop of a penny. We tried involving child services, but to no avail. We tried adopting him to get him out of there, but she would always block it. When I moved away from home, my aunt and my cousin moved in with me, and I always had to watch my aunt, so I never got to enjoy being able to drink and party. I quit school and joined the army when I was 19, just to get away from always being the adult watching over someone 16 years my senior, but I felt like I sacrificed my cousin for my own sanity ever since. This went way off topic, but I guess I just wanted to vent a bit. Sorry about that. TLDR. Daughter accused father of molestation, left home to be a prostitute, shot up a Walgreens. He recognized her on the news, and now they get to have a relationship again with her behind bars for life. My step sister's in prison for life for first-degree murder. I'll share her story in relation to my stepdad. He was well off, suburban, upper middle class, business owner with 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. Cutting the long divorce saga short, she took the kids, the money, the house, other properties in his name, his vehicles, every damn thing. He's a scary looking guy, but he never hurt a fly. She told the court otherwise. Anyway, his life was ruined by this woman. He was so broke, he drove away from his ex in Florida to his father in Philadelphia and couldn't pay the final toll. Had to wait for his dad. His credit went from 800 plus to lower than low after his wife stopped paying for the real estate in his name and maximumed his cards. In the meantime, she's manipulating the kids to the point of even forcing my brother on ADHD meds well in excess. He shakes to this day because of it. The daughter, my sister, was allowed to roam free. Drugs and prostitution at 13. The other two were a bit older and more able to keep away from the crazy. She even coerced her daughter to accuse the father of abduction and molestation. He was in jail for a couple days, but these were easily disproved. After years of her lying to the court and continually being caught, he finally won custody of the younger two. The others were adults. He married my mom. We almost had a normal life. But my sister decided to continue prostituting herself and go out doing drugs. At 16, he gave her the choice to either walk away or stop those behaviors altogether. She just up and left. Wouldn't make contact for a few years. For a while, he blamed himself for that. Probably rightly so, but it was her choice. Years later, he sees on the television late at night the blurriest image ever put to screen of a person on the run. He instantly knew it was her. I've seen the image. I can't recognize her in it for the life of me. But he did. And he couldn't bring himself to tell anybody but my mother for the next few days. He was struggling coming to terms with the fact that his baby girl killed a man and he couldn't bring himself to call with a tip. Being an idiot criminal, she was caught inside a week anyway. That tends to happen when you leave behind a gun with your prints and you're in the system and your accomplices are even dumber and get caught first and rat you out. And, let's just say the prosecutor had an easy case. Now she calls him once a week and he visits the women's prison once a month. He has his daughter back. Kinda, I guess. But there's a family out there missing a loved one because of her. Saying she's dead to me might make it sound like I feel negatively towards her, but I just don't feel anything at all about her. But her father, this was honestly good case for him, besides the murder part. He gets to have a relationship with his baby girl and not have to worry about her overdosing or getting shot. Edit. And she birthed during her first incarceration. Too much to explain. The girl was adopted by my cousin. Spoiled but living a decent life. I was 11 when it happened. Son of my dad's friend, 27 at the time. I used to play with him and his brothers a lot when I was a little kid. He often came over. I always considered him a friend and someone I could trust. Still remember showing him my drawings, etc. One day policeman came to our school and asked for my best friend. When she came back she was all pale and I knew something bad must have happened. They showed her some pics of corpses that they thought were immigrants staying near her place before they went missing. She recognized them. 2 women and a man. Beaten to death, then threw into a pond. Not long after they were found, him and his friend, who I also knew, were arrested. They were supposed to smuggle the victims to Germany. Once they've messed up, second time weather made it impossible. They had to cross the river. They already took money for it and managed to spend it. No motivation to actually do what they were paid for. What to do with them? People losing patience, hiding. Smashing their skulls with baseball bat sounds like an idea, right? Whenever I think of this guy, I see him sitting in our living room and smiling at me. It's been 16 years and I'm getting goosebumps each faking time. His mom acted like nothing ever happened. Total detachment. Zero change in her behavior. Same about his grandma, who was living right next to us. My parents also act like he never existed and wasn't babysitting me occasionally. Probably get buried, but oh well. When I was born in San Antonio, TX, my mom gave birth to me 3 months early. Oh, weighted a little under 2 pounds when born. I had breathing tubes, ventilators and all that to help keep me alive. Well, my mom had lost a little girl at 8 months pregnant about a year prior, so she was still pretty fake to be see of that. From what I've been told and read in court papers, she had a mental break and just lost it. I was suffering from seizures, heart attacks, strokes every few days BC of the amount of drugs they'd had me on. Well, she claims to have done it out of love and wanting to end my suffering from the pain. She ended up pulling my breathing tubes 3 times and was eventually caught on cameras. She and my dad were in the Air Force at the time, and long story short, I guess the judge and DA saw it as a crime of passion and sentenced her to 10 years 6 months, with having already been in county jail for like a year. My brother, 4 years older than me, my father and I all moved to a different state after she was sentenced, and after she got out she moved to where we lived, fought for custody of my brother and IBC. Our father was abusive and got it, except my brother ended up going to stay w her, and my dad kept me. My brother joined the Marines and I went in and out of juvie and prison until about 3 years ago, when I got out and moved away from my father, and he hasn't spoken to me or my brother in years. I've tried finding info online about everything because I know there's stuff my family's hiding, but haven't found any luck. Daughter of a killer rather than parent. After my mom died, my dad's alcoholism became worse, and he also returned to drugs after not using them since before he married my mom. And during this time, he met Debbie, a woman I could write a book on what deplorable human being she was. But she enabled his drug and alcohol abuse, so she was the perfect fit for my mentally ill, narcissistic father. During the course of their relationship they'd fight and make up over and over again, usually because Debbie would steal whatever she could from my dad or was cheating on him. Sometimes she'd leave for a week, each promising it was over, and back she'd be soon enough. Police were called several times to our house during their arguments, where they'd threaten kill each other, and where Debbie would then threaten to have me and my sisters raped or killed if she didn't get her way. I wish I could say it was those threats that was what made my dad murder her, because then I'd at least have had some consolation that my dad cared for me enough to not tolerate someone making those threats. But no, these sorts of fights went on for years until I moved out. Several months later, they were on one of their makeup periods, and then I guess they got into one of these same arguments and my dad strangled her in the bed he once shared with my mom. He fled in his car and eventually called the police on himself, saying how he was going to kill himself for what he'd done. The police managed to apprehend him alive and my dad was convicted of manslaughter. I haven't spoken to him in about 8 years now. He's apparently changed. He got clean in jail and he's getting the mental health treatment he's always needed. He's said how guilty he feels for how awful he treated my sisters and me, and how he feels he failed me especially. Honestly, I still don't know what to feel. I believe he's changed. My dad isn't a liar. If anything, he's brutally honest. Still, I don't know when I'll be ready to talk to him, if ever. My dad and I have a very non-existent relationship. I shouldn't even call that man my dad. He caused a lot of emotional and mental trauma that is still in the works of becoming better. When I was 6, we were supposed to have supervised visitation. I wasn't aware of this, but he was. He took me with his mom's permission off their property, and we drove somewhere in the middle of nowhere for a walk on a trail. I remember he started talking in this really creepy low voice, and me being young I didn't know how to handle the situation, so I tried to walk a bit ahead of him and hum to myself. There were rocks that went along each side of the path and I walked on those. He was talking, but not to me, more to himself, and he told a story of how he lured someone in by pretending to be their friend, even though he hated them, and smashed their head in with a rock and decapitated them, and hid the body. I still to this day have no idea if he was just high out of his mind as usual, or if I seriously know part of the story to a missing person out there. I think about it often and only recently told people around me, because up until recently I always thought he was just crazy. I watched the Ted Bundy documentary, and he was just like my dad. Something clicked and I thought, maybe I should have told someone back then. On the ride home he picked up a friend and they talked about doing meth after I went home. It sucks because I actually have a relevant story if you dilute parent down to relative, but it's so faked up and identifying that I can't share it. Wonder what other stories people are sitting on that they'd toss out if the internet were genuinely anonymous. Edit. This was originally supposed to be my burner account, lol. Making a throwaway won't cut it. The kid's still a minor and my wife plus I are in the middle of stepping in to try to foster them, so it would be a colossal fuck up if someone found me blabbing private info about them online. Maybe someday they can talk about their own story when the situation isn't so messy and immediate. Till then, there aren't enough VPNs in the world. What I can say is that their intentions weren't terrible, even though it wasn't an accident. Sometimes when you grow up in a certain kind of situation, your reality is a bit separate from most people's reality. He genuinely believed that killing the victim would send them to a better place. The start of his life makes that conclusion seem reasonable. All I can feel about it is speechlessly sad and enraged at the suffering of everyone involved. It doesn't make me feel more empathy towards adults who've willfully killed, but when I see stories about juvenile offenders now, I'm going to always wonder now about how much of the story we don't know. I love/like this kid a whole lot more than I do the adult BO and foster families that utterly failed them. They should be the ones stigmatized with blood on their hands. I can't trust them completely for a long time, knowing what I know, but the potential's there if they continue to recover and grow. My great-grandmother tried to kill my great-grandfather. My mother was a child when it happened, 7 or 8, so old enough to have permanent memory impressions. My knowledge of the event comes from her. Great-grandpa used to be rather free and open with his anger. He used to beat his wife, great-grandma. No one thought much of it. This was the 40s and 50s. Great-grandma got thrown up against the wall one too many times and eventually fought back. She shot him with a revolver, and upon coming to her senses and feeling horribly guilty, shot herself. She died. He was paralyzed from the waist down. He went on to battle a morphine addiction, but eventually died an old and well cared for man. Great-grandma's sister was heavily into religious research, including fooling around with Ouija boards a lot, so we kinda wonder if perhaps there wasn't already an element of mental instability in that family to begin with. The most marked takeaway from the event is my mother's understandable, extreme fear of handguns. Not a parent, but I know a guy, and this was like 5 years ago. My girlfriend had home problems when she was younger, and her mother had been prone to fits of abuse and domestic violence, but it had been my understanding that this was old behavior and that she was okay now. One dark and stormy night, not a joke, it really was dark and raining, in August of 2014, the mom goes off crazier than I'd seen her. It'd been around for about 4-ish months at the time. I quietly sit in my girlfriend's room while the mom goes after my girlfriend. I'm drunk, and, I found out later, drugged on Ritalin, and I haven't known this family long enough to get involved. It was awkward. ABD weird girlfriend comes into my room, tells me to pack up, we are leaving. I get my stuff, me, girlfriend and her brother all go out and get into our cars to head to my place for the night. We were almost in the clear, so faking close. Mom comes outside and screams that if they don't take their dogs with them she's going to kill them. Girlfriend and brother run back into the house, and I sit in my car smoking a cigarette. The doors to their home are thrown wide, so I can hear them yelling. Out of nowhere, girlfriend's yelling turns to screaming, and finally I get off my ass. What I walk in to is the mother on the floor with blood pooling around her, and the brother is looking at me shocked and confused, not knowing what happened. Girlfriend is going nuts, rightly so, trying to roll her 300+ pound mother over to start CPR. I call 911, police come. Mother dies right there in the home. The brother got 2 years in jail during the trial. Judge said he could clearly see this was anger/self-defense, and there was a history of abuse in the home which set the building blocks for this incident. The brother is a nice guy, really funny, and we got along great until I broke up with his sister. Now, even though girlfriend and I are back together, he doesn't like me very much. But when we did get along, we got along swimmingly. Him and I share the same sense of humor, and he's very fun to be around. He has a full-time job now, is a productive member of society. So the story ends on a high note. TLDR, girlfriend's brother kills mother in self-defense and is an okay dude who is working a job and has a good life. The first and only time my son killed. It really was a bit of a shock. I wasn't expecting it. He was 10 years old at the time. It was a really beautiful typical Midwest summer day. I remember leaving windows open. I'm doing some cleaning in the kitchen. My son comes in with this face I'd never seen before. I could tell he was pretty upset. So I do what any good mom would do and start asking questions. At first he didn't want to talk to me about it. I could see the shame on his face. So of course my mind starts racing. I'm trying to ask open-ended questions to see what I can get out of him. When he breaks down and tells me he killed it to see what it felt like, instantly my heart sinks. Where is our 9-pound dog? I remember thinking. He then tells me he didn't like killing it. So, what is it? Trying to think if I missed signs of him being a serial killer. Rewatching scenes in my mind from the ID channel, thinking where I went wrong. He finally admits what he's so torn up about. He killed a fly. Nothing too torturous, I mean for being killed and all. But it made him feel so terrible. So I told him I loved him, and that it's a good thing he knows that about himself. To this day I've never told anyone else about this. He may be a killer, but he's got a heart of gold. Edit. Thank you kind Redditor for the gold. I figured such a heavy question needed something a little more uplifting. But it still answered the question. 4 months ago my best friend killed a 43-year-old guy. So my best friend just turned 20, 3 days before this happening. He went to buy some shrooms, and because my best friend is homeless the guy just let him do the shrooms in his apartment. Out of nowhere he got a psychosis and just went up and stabbed him with a knife like 10 to 15 times. I visited him in jail a month ago, and he's almost too normal for it to be true. I'm not a doctor and I don't know if it's possible to get a psychosis for a very short time, but it just seems so unreal. After killing him, he just went back to his apartment with blood all over his clothes. I live in a small town and several people later told me that they saw him walking with blood all over himself in full daylight 6 p.m. It was also like kind of a homeless shelter. I've heard that when he went back he just told the people working there that he just saw someone get killed. Then he went to sleep with all of his clothes on. And of course they called the police. I live in a country where a life sentence means 16 years and that's probably what he will be sentenced to, since he also killed a guy on his property. Fortunately I don't know much about the case besides what the news said, because if you aren't sentenced yet, then you're not allowed to talk about it when visiting. There's always a police officer in the room. I feel so bad for the guy, because he honestly just let him stay at his apartment and chill. And I'm also very interested in why he wasn't able to do self-defense. Me and my best friend did drugs, MDMA, together for the first time 4 years ago. And ever since he's been a drug addict to whatever he could get his hands on. I took an education and have a part-time job in the airport, only doing coke on special occasions. I think about it every day. He's just a guy with a bunch of silly stick and poke tattoos we did together, always blasting to house music with me. Fact. A year and a half ago, one of the 4 platters that I had passed away unexpectedly. There were 5 fish, 4 platters, and 1 guppy. My siblings and I decided that we would buy a new guppy to keep the other guppy company. The new guppy, whose name was Snazzy, violently attacked the platters and basically murdered one by causing it to die due to stress. GD, the og guppy, didn't give a fuck. He joined in with Snazzy, and the other 2 platters began to deliberately hide themselves. So, it was decided that Snazzy would get his own separate tank because he killed one of the platters. Well, GD pulled a monkey see monkey do thing and began attacking the platters himself. It warranted his removal, and we put him in with Snazzy. Snazzy faking hated GD for some reason and kept nipping at GD's tail. GD fought back and apparently took out one of Snazzy's fins. Snazzy was pissed off even more and switched to actually trying to bite at GD. GD passed away June 2018, having been murdered outright by Snazzy. Snazzy, who earned the scorn of everyone, wound up dying that July. Nobody misses him, and we sincerely hope he burns in hell for his decisions. I just provided one source, because it was literally one of many that popped up in a quick search. In 2009 the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a report titled Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, A Path Forward, and Obama formed a commission to bring more scientific approaches to a field that is very subjective. Of course under Trump, this commission has been disbanded. My issue with forensic science is that all of their approaches fall under that general term of forensic science, and it's clear that many of their approaches for things such as hair and fiber analysis, blood splatter analysis, fingerprinting, etc. are not based on sound scientific principles. It doesn't matter that it's widely accepted. That doesn't mean that many of these methods are scientific. The scientific method is very precise in what is required, and forensic science fails this test in many areas. 2 examples. Fingerprint evidence. Many people believe that it is a fact. This is not the case. It's an unproven theory. The matching of fingerprints is even more sketchy and standards vary widely between forensic scientists. To present fingerprint evidence as if it is science is misleading at best. Wound analysis. In this particular post we were discussing that a forensic scientist should be able to determine whether injuries were caused by a fall versus an attack. Again, there aren't scientific studies that one can rely on here. It's all the subjective opinion of the forensic person testifying. Yet by having all of this pseudoscience fall under the umbrella of a field of science, jurors believe it is the same as DNA analysis, which it most certainly is not. Perhaps the most disturbing fact is that many states do not require their forensic lab to be accredited. Only 83% of all forensic labs are accredited across all types jurisdictions. Pretty scary if you are accused of a crime and facing testimony from a forensic expert from a lab that is even accredited. Just because I put on a white coat and have a lab doesn't mean I'm a scientist or that I follow scientific methods to determine my results. Unfortunately, our criminal justice system doesn't make that distinction clear to juries.